Bored in Butler County? Need to know where to catch a show this weekend? What events are even happening in the area? I'm Molly Miller, one of the writers behind the Butler Eagles Weekend Entertainment section, and I'm here to banish the boredom from your cold and rainy days. Sign up and receive Miller Minutes, that's my column, and a list of Butler County-based events direct to your inbox every Thursday afternoon by visiting bit.ly/ButlerEagleWE newsletter. That's bit.ly/ButlerEagleWE newsletter. You can also find the latest events under the A&E tab at www.butlereagle.com. Click Weekend Entertainment, or pick up Thursday's print edition of the paper for the latest events. See, there's lots to do in Butler County when you read the Butler Eagles Weekend Entertainment section. Visit bit.ly/ButlerEagleWE newsletter to sign up for the weekly newsletter, so you won't be bored in Butler County again.
Hello, and welcome to this season of Alter Eagle. We are starting season 1 with the topic of addiction in Butler County. Conversations on the physical side of addiction, trauma, the neuroscience, mental health, and stigma surrounding addiction. Experts, resources, and stories from people who have fought addiction head on. I am your host, Laura Krigo. Let's keep the conversation going. Now a word from our sponsor, BetterHelp. For a long time, I suffered with depression and anxiety. I had tried therapy before, but struggled finding a therapist I connected with until I found BetterHelp. That's why I am so excited to share BetterHelp's mission to make therapy more affordable and more accessible, because finding a therapist can be hard, especially when you're limited to the options in your area. BetterHelp is a platform that makes finding a therapist easier because it's online. Remote therapy sessions, and by filling out a few questions, BetterHelp can match you to a professional therapist in as little as a few days. It's easy to sign up and get matched with a therapist. Click the link in description and receive 10% off your first month of BetterHelp. And by clicking that link, you support this channel. Plus, you can easily switch to a new therapist at no additional cost without stressing about insurance, who's in your network, or anything like that. I was struggling for a long time, and BetterHelp was where I found my therapist, Whitney, who I still see weekly for almost 2 years now. So, if you're struggling, like I was, consider online therapy with BetterHelp. Click the link in description or go to betterhelp.com/altereagle. That's betterhelp.com/altereagle. There's no better time than now to start your mental health journey. Thank you again, BetterHelp, for supporting this channel. Monday morning. Yeah, it's Monday. Maybe it's not morning for you. Maybe you're listening to this and it's the next day. But either way, thank you for listening. I appreciate your support. We here at the Eagle appreciate your support, and my team. I feel very fortunate to have people that I get to work with closely, and it's nice because we've got this good flow going, and I just wanted to say that I'm appreciative. Today's episode, wow, we recorded it in January, so I was a little nervous when I started editing because I'm like, oh gosh, was I still having my little moments of wow, yes. So I apologize. We all have our things that we don't like about our mannerisms. You pick something out. Maybe you're not like that. I just am. I know things about myself, and especially when you have to watch video and audio of yourself and you're like, oh, cringe. So anyways, wasn't so bad because I'm sort of at this place where I'm like, can't go back. Can't do it over. But I did want to give these guys a round of applause. They, from the get-go of launching the podcast, both Dr. Brophy and Joe Mahoney were just so integral in so many different aspects of it. I was sort of scrambling last minute for the first episode, which was a live recording that we did January 25th at Vintage Coffee House, I remember thinking, oh my gosh, I don't have someone to sit down with me for like an hour and talk. And then I thought, yes, I do. Yes, I do. I also pulled Alyssa Verrell 2 days before, and I'm like, I got an idea. I think it'd be cool to have you up there as well. And then you can talk about the trauma side, and then we can swap you out with Rachel Schuster, and it's going to be bing, bang, bongo, yes. And I think it worked out exactly the way I wanted it to. And I appreciate Tammy Shuey, my boss, for trusting me in that, because I would tell her my ideas, and she'd be like,
Tell her
well, and I'm like, just trust me. It's going to be great. We're going to start with those three, and then Alyssa will sit down, Rachel will come up, and we'll end with stigma. How's that? And it worked out perfectly. So just reminiscing where we started and excited to see what the future brings. So, you know, we still are on the topic of addiction. There's a lot that we still just need to uncover and dig into. And I think where we're at right now is we have a lot of amazing resources in our county, experts, people with lived experience. And that is so important in this arena, because having lived experience means you're going to be able to give that person not only the opportunity to, you know, change their life, but to realize that they are capable of doing anything that they set their mind to. And I think that's really what we're talking about here. I'm not over it yet. I'm going to have some more episodes. I'm going to start sprinkling in other topics, I'm excited. I'm not saying anything just yet. I'm talking to Tammy about it. And again, I'm in that era of like, just trust me, it's going to work. Hey, it's like spaghetti. Have you ever cooked spaghetti and you're like, this is done? Just take a noodle out of the thing and throw it against the wall. And if it sticks, it's done.
Joining me today are Dr. Brophy, Medical Director of the Geyser Center and local physician who's board certified in both addiction medicine and emergency medicine. Joe Mahoney is joining us as well, Executive Director at the Ellen O'Brien Geyser Center. Licensed social worker with 16 years of experience in mental and behavioral health fields. Hi, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Predisposition to mental health and addiction can worsen or trigger that. Do you remember what it was that you said that was? Or am I just?
No, we did have that talk, and I actually like that you picked up on that, because that was like a very quick part of the
reference.
It was kind of an obscure reference, so that was a good test that you were paying attention.
Like, because that was something, I don't know why, I don't know if it was the way that you said it, but talking about
very,
that and how
very profound, right? It was
there was I put an asterisk next to it, and it took me forever to find it because I have all these notes. But
so in the context of what we were talking about today, and there's a couple ways we can take this. Mm-hmm. In the context of what we were talking about today was that, say I'm somebody that's struggling with addiction, mm-hmm. and I have an underlying maybe genetic disposition toward bipolar disorder.
Okay.
The substance of use and abuse that I am using may potentially exacerbate or wake up, quote unquote, that sort of genetic disposition that I have, which if the substance were removed from that equation totally, there's a possibility that the symptoms of say the bipolar or whatever the diagnosis is, those symptoms may never have risen to the surface. So the substance at times can sort of induce or exacerbate or bring to the surface something that may be laying dormant. And the other way we can take this is, there's a model that sort of kind of very easily explains this, called the diathesis stress model. And what that means is, you have your baseline here.
Okay.
And we all of us as humans have a genetic predisposition toward many things, stuff we probably don't even know about. But when things are going well in our life and things are going right, we stay at a baseline.
Okay.
And that's what this model says. We stay at a baseline. And as blocks start building against us in life, we start kind of coasting upward. So the context of our lives are very important because it's what's happening in the external environment. And we might start coasting upward, and then bam, we're going to hit an intersection of gene and context, genetics and context, social situation. That may then exacerbate, what was laying dormant. So, we have a lot of conversation, discussion, just in general around siblings, for instance. So, we can identify certain mental health genes, through these kind of studies of families and siblings and twins. But why does one twin maybe display the symptoms of it and the other one doesn't?
Yes.
And that model kind of strives to somehow touch on that surface of, maybe the one twin, for whatever reason, has a coping mechanism or has developed a coping mechanism throughout his or her life that, as the context is rising, they're still kind of able to manage it, and it hasn't quite hit this threshold yet. Whereas the other twin, for whatever reason, maybe has not developed that coping mechanism, or their nervous system is overwhelmed by the external environment. At which point, they're now crossing into that threshold. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of a very similar concept to at times, there are a lot of theories out there that at times when we look at this dual diagnosis comorbidity of mental health and drug and alcohol, that the substance itself is sort of what's inducing the gene, the mental health gene, or the disturbance or the symptomatology that was already there and existing and was laying dormant until that substance started to kind of take effect over the brain. So it's sort of a very complex, kind of convoluted, where it's really an intersection between, neuroscience and neurobiology and mental health and addiction. It sort of all kind of coming together into this storm, if you will.
The most extreme example that we see of that is with schizophrenia, so
Okay.
young men in particular that have a genetic predisposition for schizophrenia and have family members that are schizophrenic. If those young males, particularly around the ages of, like 17 to 22, if they start experimenting, particularly with amphetamine-based stimulants, there's a good chance that will cause the schizophrenia to rise to the surface. And that can be absolutely terrifying. And I actually witnessed that happen in two of my friends that were twins. They were genetically identical.
Wow.
They thrived all through, grade school, middle school, and high school. They were state champion wrestlers, both of them. Great guys, loved them both. One's now dead of a drug overdose. The other one is has severe schizophrenia, mental health, and you can see them walking around the streets. And that all started when they went to Edinburgh and they were wrestling and they started experimenting a bit. That turned into the basically the schizophrenia kind of rising to the surface. And then from that point forward, it was all mental health.
Yep.
There was still some substance use involved there, but if those two guys weren't on their medications for schizophrenia, all bets were off. It was a scary thing to witness, and that's the most common story, about with schizophrenia. But it can happen with depression. It can happen with bipolar. Like that. There's other drugs that can cause a mental health
Okay.
situation
and
to rise.
we really kind of look to at sometimes the substance of use and substance of abuse, because, in that kind of situation, the methamphetamines would sort of be a really bad kind of combination to add on to a schizophrenic, a gene for schizophrenia, because that substance in and of itself a lot of times mirrors what those symptoms are or what that pathological course looks like. So you're sort of already adding fuel to a fire there. And likewise, we have a lot of people that are in recovery from alcohol. We'll talk about how long it truly took them to realize that the alcohol that they thought they were using to self-medicate and to feel better and to escape was truly their depressant. And yes, we know alcohol is a depressant, scientifically speaking, and all that good stuff. But it's people don't realize that, and it's not until after the fact of years of sustained use where they kind of start to say, like, maybe this is making me feel more depressed or act more depressed or whatever it may be than I normally would be, because it is slowing down everything now. And you know, that it's striking when you hear these people that are in recovery from alcohol kind of talk about that, about like, you know, I turned to it because I was feeling really depressed, and you know, all this stuff was happening in my life, and I needed to cope, and I needed an escape. And I liked that way I felt that, you know, first time, second time, third time, and then it starts to go downhill a little bit.
Yeah, that's what's interesting to me, because obviously you realize that if you've personally experienced that. So I think I have experienced that and gotten into depression, but then it's something that I'm just automatically doing, right? I come home and I'm pouring a glass of wine.
Yep.
And then by the end of the night, the bottle's gone. And I drank the whole bottle. And there's nights where I would come home and be like, I'm not drinking tonight. And it was really hard not to have a glass of wine or just one. And then it's that whole thing of, it's almost like anxiety inducing. Then I would feel anxiety because I couldn't self medicate or soothe myself the way that I was used to it. Right. So that makes sense. Even though I would know it would get to a point where I was like crying or something dramatic was happening. So it's all very fascinating to me. And I think, Dr. Brophy, you said something too about that. Is there a certain age where typically these, you know, with schizophrenia specifically, where they can tend to come out even without like substance? Or
so yeah, I mean, the typical age of like a presenting schizophrenic is age like 18 to 20. And so that's really the time window when it's kind of the most confusing. And I, as an ER physician, like I've been on the receiving end of that, you know, more times than I can count, where a family shows up and they're like, we don't know what's going on. Like he's peeking out the windows. He's paranoid that people are coming to get him. And, you know, you start to see that acute psychosis starting to kind of present itself. And acute psychosis is usually, you know, a mix of confusion, some paranoid delusions, you know, but it's clearly abnormal thinking. And when those kids are brought in to the ER by their family who's in panic mode, they've never seen anything like this before, you know, one of the first things we're checking is a urine drug screen, because as Joe had mentioned, like the substance abuse themselves, like if that person is abusing particularly like strong amphetamine stimulants like methamphetamine, you know, or crack cocaine, well, you're going to see what looks like acute psychosis of schizophrenia. They're going to have paranoid delusions. They're going to be looking all over the place and, you know, having this like hyper-stimulated kind of presentation. And you know, it's heartbreaking, because I've been in those situations where, you know, like that young adult is denying, and you're almost relieved when you see methamphetamine in their urine, because you're like, okay, this is the effects of the drug. You know, if that urine drug screen is negative and that person is saying like, I've never touched any of those drugs in my life, that's a pretty good indication that you're actually dealing with new onset schizophrenia, which is, as someone who's had those conversations with those families, like it's devastating, because they know that, okay, well, depression, okay, we know people that have depression and they've come out of that. Anxiety, okay, some of us have anxiety and we medicate that, and you know, our quality of life isn't tremendously impacted. Schizophrenia? I mean, certainly you can live a very normal life with good quality of life if you're on the right medications and you're getting the right care. But people also know what else can happen, you know, with schizophrenia, especially when it's not well managed. You know? And so that's a very scary visit.
And you know, schizophrenia is kind of like Dr. Brophy said, you know, from the ER standpoint or from the clinical standpoint. You know, when you have somebody that is clearly presenting with clear-cut schizophrenia in front of you, and your stomach kind of drops for them a little bit, because a lot of mental health disorders, and schizophrenia is one of them, where it can be, as Dr. Bruce said, managed very well, and you can lead a pretty good quality of life. But it is it's a chronic, I mean, it truly is a chronic mental health diagnosis, and it's a progressive mental health diagnosis. So, you know, what that means for a lot of folks who unfortunately have that diagnosis, you know, sometimes when he sees them in the ER, that unfortunately might be the best functioning that they're going to have at this point, because that disease sort of does really wreck the brain, and it can wreck it. So when you're adding on the substances on top of that, I mean, you can only imagine what is truly happening at that point, to the brain, and that is one of the, the true heavy duty. That's like a heavy hitter in the mental health world.
Schizophrenia is one that's like, whoa. Yeah. When you have somebody coming in and it, the way it presents, is truly like, it's either, like Dr. Brophy said, it's either schizophrenia or it's methamphetamine. I mean, there's no in between on that.
There's no gray.
There's no gray area. When you see it truly in front of you, you know one of two things is going on there, and if it's not one, it's definitely the other.
Right.
Wow. And is that something that typically can also be hereditary?
Yes, there's a strong genetic component to it. So it's one of the first things we ask is, the two questions you want to ask is when that person is first experiencing those symptoms, have you been using any drugs? And if so, which ones? And what's your family history, your mental health of your family history? Because if mom, dad, aunts, uncles, siblings, or even grandparents had schizophrenia, then that person is now at risk for developing the same condition. People don't often present with schizophrenia if there's absolutely no family history of it whatsoever. So there's a strong genetic component to schizophrenia.
Okay. I had a little bit of experience with that in college with a roommate, and it was scary. Like I had to move out. It got pretty bad to the point where when I would see her after these experiences with her where she would just totally go off, the next time I'd see her, it'd be like, hey.
Right. It's confusing.
And I didn't know how to respond to that. And so for me, it's like, I'm not going to respond like in an aggressive way or be like, who do you think you are? Because I knew something else was, so it's scary. And I think giving people the information is good. And obviously, what would you tell someone who maybe knows that that's in their family history?
I tell them to proceed with caution.
Okay.
I tell them that, and I'm always quick to educate them on what Joe had just mentioned, that like experimentation in most young adults is in itself is not going to completely wreck their lives. But if you're genetically predisposed to schizophrenia, experimentation one time can absolutely be the thing that, pushes that person into now all of a sudden this mental health condition that is such a big impact on their day-to-day life. I mean, like, and not to say that, all the other mental health conditions aren't severe and important. Of course they are, but we all know people who struggle with bipolar or depression or anxiety or, all of the other, things that we talk about. But with schizophrenia, because it's progressive over time, because we know it's likely going to worsen, over the next couple decades of their life, we start to think like, okay, well, how many high functioning schizophrenics do we know? Like, not a lot. And so that's why it's so devastating. Like when they come in and they're just now realizing like, oh my God, we do have an uncle that had schizophrenia, and now our 18-year-old child is showing those same symptoms. That immediately takes them down that rabbit hole, and they're thinking of the very poor quality of life that their family member had, and now their child is going to be facing that same thing, and it's understandable. And I mean, I even get emotional when I'm having those conversations, and I'm trying to explain to people like, look, it is manageable. There are medications that help, but that's a different conversation than somebody who's coming in with depression or anxiety, who truly can resume some normalcy, once they get on the right treatments, the right counseling, the right cognitive behavioral therapy, like they're going to live a fairly normal life. Some of the mental health conditions, schizophrenia in particular is like the one where, it's so scary because it is so difficult to manage, honestly, and because it progressively worsens over the course of that person's life.
Okay. And I know we're gonna get to the neuroscience of addiction and all that. So the one last thing I did want to ask you about that. So obviously whenever, you have NA and you have AA and you have therapy, and there's so many different resources for everything else we're really going to get into today. But with last question on schizophrenia, other than medication, are there support groups?
Yes.
I'd imagine like going to therapy, what would be the other things that you would say to someone, right?
Yeah, I mean, somebody that's diagnosed with schizophrenia, like as Dr. Brophy said, I mean, there's hope out there, but you have to follow a very regimented, course of treatment with good psychiatric care.
Okay.
And I'm not talking about, a PCP handling your antipsychotic medications or your mood stabilizers, whatever cocktails med cocktails they're putting you on. You need to be with a specialized doctor that truly knows that field, knows the latest trends and research and all of that. And in addition to that, there are therapies out there for somebody, that might be going through that. And the earlier, as with everything, the earlier you kind of seek that help and that treatment, the better off. A lot of those therapies focus on skill building.
Okay.
So and again, not to paint too bleak of a picture, but somebody that has a schizophrenia course and diagnosis, a lot of times, and if you think about truly what's going on in their brains and what that disease can look like, they start to lose like their social skills, their activities of daily living. Those sort of skills start to kind of decline as the disease gets worse. So as much as a therapeutic program can kind of keep reinforcing and instilling those skills into somebody, unfortunately, a lot of people with schizophrenia, they don't do well in a traditional outpatient setting. Like when we think about somebody with depression or anxiety, they go to maybe outpatient counseling 1 hour a week. They get the skills that they need. And they're able to function, pretty high functioning, normal, quote unquote normal, typical lives. Somebody that has schizophrenia is a lot. There are a lot of times that's not enough, for them. That 1-2 hours a week is not enough. So a lot of times you'll find them in like day treatment programs.
Okay.
Which still does provide for them that access to independent living, where they can go home and maintain a family, home, job, whatever it may be. But their day is pretty wrapped up, maybe 3 times a week with social skills groups and processing groups and insight groups and those sort of things. In addition, they build in their med checks into that with their psychiatrists to make sure they're staying on top of the meds. And a lot of people with schizophrenia, they can be able to maintain a job. They may be able to have a part-time job and they're fine, but they have to really, really stay on top of their treatment. They have to really go to their therapy appointments or their programming. They have to stay on top of their medications with their psychiatrist. A lot of times when we see these people that have already been diagnosed with schizophrenia and have been on, treatment, and then they end up back in the hospital or the ER, a lot of times you start delving into it, they stop something. They either went non-med compliant, or they stopped taking their meds. And a lot of times too, that's out of their control. Some other disorders or diagnoses, when they stop taking their meds, like that's because they're like, hey, I'm feeling great. I'm not taking my med. I'm not taking my med anymore. I'm feeling great right now. Schizophrenia, sometimes they don't have that. It's mainly like, it could be a delusion that they're having at that point, that the med's poison, for instance, and they won't take it. So even the med piece sometimes is out of their control, where somebody has to really, really help them stay on top of that, and get treatment instantly when you start to see these signs.
Right. But as far as schizophrenia goes in the world, like when we talk about all the different mental health conditions that people can suffer from, I think the biggest difference that makes schizophrenia in a bit of a different category is, for a lot of those things like certainly depression and anxiety, but even things like bipolar and PTSD, like there's options, right? Like you can maybe go a little more heavy on the pharmacological side and a little bit less on the behavioral health, therapy side. With schizophrenia, like if they're not taking the medications, things will just get worse and worse and worse. So like with schizophrenia, the compliance to the antipsychotic medications is like you won't make any progress if that's not stabilized
Right.
first. And that's where it differs a little bit from the ones like,
Yep.
depression, anxiety, because that, like, someone can say like, well, I'm not big on pharmaceuticals, like I'd rather do this. I'll do IOP. I'll do counseling every day. I'll do whatever it takes. Schizophrenic doesn't have that option. Like if they say no to the meds, they're going to have paranoid delusions.
Yeah.
They're going to be peeking out windows. Like it basically impacts their quality of life to a point that they're non-functioning.
Yeah, they need to really adhere to the medication regimen.
Yeah, a lot
Yeah.
more than the others. Yeah.
And you answered a question that I had, even though I said the other one was my last one. It wasn't. So I'm like, wait, I have one more.
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. This episode is brought to you by Butler County District Attorney Richard A. Goldinger, R.W. McDonald and Sons Incorporated, Robert Stevens Jewelers. Thank you to our sponsors for your support on our first season of the Alter Ego podcast. Be sure to click the link in bio for your discount for BetterHelp Therapy online. 10% off your first month. Something we really want to talk about is the neuroscience of addiction. Help us understand addiction better. So do you want to talk a little bit more about that, Dr. Brophy?
Yeah, sure. As time goes on, we're understanding more and more about just the field of neuroscience in general, which helps us understand really everything about how our minds work, how our brains work, but particularly in relation to addiction medicine. It explains several things, and it's reason why it's one of my favorite topics to talk about whenever we do talk about addiction, treatment, medication-assisted treatment. How do people end up in those different situations where they're battling these substance use disorders, and our brain, it's such a fascinating organ, right? Like our bodies, I mean, obviously, like I'm somebody who's interested in that kind of stuff, but the physiology of our bodies is just fascinating to me because it's like we're these machines that were built to self-repair and self-modify and adapt and evolve, and our bodies and brains are so resilient. And when you look at what's happening in addiction, we all look from, 1,000 yards away at these behaviors and we look back at these situations and stories that we're aware of. And we look through a lens, with a certain type of judgment, like, well, how could that person be so stupid? Or how could they be so evil? Or how could they be so selfish? Or how could they be so destructive, whatever, pick your, negative adjective. And we apply that from the outside, partially because of our own human psychology and it makes us feel a little bit better. And partly because we don't really understand what's happening, in the brain of that individual. But when you do understand the neuroscience and the neurophysiology of what's happening in the world of addiction, you not only have a better understanding of the behaviors that you're seeing, but you, even more significantly, you understand the mountain that we're up against in the world of treatment. Those brain changes are slow and they're happening over a period of time where it's being repeatedly stimulated to change in that way. And then all of a sudden we're telling people like, well, all right, your brain has changed over these past 10 years of abusing substances, but now you just need to make better choices and you just need to go back to how your brain was, before all of that. And that's where we get into, the disease of addiction, and a lot of people are very hesitant to call addiction a disease. And I have these conversations all the time. If I ask a room full of healthcare professionals, do you think addiction is a choice or do you think it's a disease? They'll all say disease. The entire room of healthcare professionals will say, we're taught that it's a disease. We're educated that it's a disease. We can see the pathology on scans and functional MRIs. And that's the definition of a disease. It's abnormal pathology, abnormal physiology, so we know it's a disease. When I ask a room full of people that are struggling with substance use disorders, they all say, I just make bad choices. I don't know why I keep making bad choices, but I just can't seem to make the right choices. Even when I want to make better choices, I make bad choices, and those bad choices are why I'm here today.
Interesting.
It is. It's fascinating. Yeah. And so when I go around and I talk to high school students, I'll ask the whole auditorium. That's typically one of the questions I'll start with. This is a conversation that a lot of you have had at home around the dinner table and in your circles. is addiction a disease or a choice? Let's see a raise of hands. And I'll get about 50-50. You know, about half the kids will say, you know, like, nope, my parents told me I got to make, you know, the right choices. If I make the bad choices, I'll be an addict, you know, that kind of stuff. And other people are, you know, they're a little bit more familiar with, you know, that it's at least taught that way, you know, that it's a disease. Mm-hmm. I always remind people that the hesitation to call it a disease, like I understand where that comes from. And mainly where it seems to come from is people, they want accountability to be a part of that conversation. They don't want it to be the same as you saying like, listen, bud, you got cancer. You didn't do anything to cause this cancer, but you know, we're going to help you. We're going to get you better. And when they think of a disease, that's what they're thinking of. They're thinking of like some unfortunate thing that rose to the surface that, you know, now everybody's going to come together and help that person. And it was no fault of their own. That's not what we're saying when we call addiction a disease. You know, we're simply saying that it is a measurable pathology and abnormal physiology. We can see it on scans. We have different criteria that can clearly differentiate this person from that person. And it's a chronic and progressive thing that can, you know, relapse at any time. And as long as you are making progresses and those relapses are getting less severe and further apart, then just like many other diseases, now you're making progress and that progress will improve the quality of life for that individual. Does it still start as a choice? Most of the time. You know, so that it's important to say that because there is that accountability aspect early on, especially. But as the choice to put that substance in their body results in changes in their brain that are then going to affect all of the downstream choices, now you're in that world of it being a disease where it's not as simple as, well, just make better choices, you know, and when you have abnormal physiology, it's very difficult to do that. So that's one of the, you know, the many reasons that I am so interested and fascinated in the neuroscience of addiction. And I love how the neuroscience of addiction, when you actually look at it, explains all the crazy behaviors, like, you know, a mom who gave their baby heroin or, you know, somebody else who put themselves or their loved ones in harm's way in a way that doesn't really make sense to the rest of us. You know, when you understand the neuronal hierarchy and you understand the neuroplasticity and all these other really interesting aspects of the neuroscience of addiction, then you understand why those behaviors are the result of those brain changes.
And why it's so difficult, like why treatment can be so difficult.
Exactly.
Like you said,
Yes.
If someone's been abusing alcohol for 10 years, you can't just say, I'll make better decisions. And in a year, they're going to be fine. They're going to be sober. It's not, it takes... Right, you're like retraining your brain, essentially.
Exactly.
So when we talk about MAT, for instance, medication-assisted treatment, what it is, I think people need to understand that.
Absolutely.
Because there's a lot of misconception, right?
Yes, very much.
Okay.
So medication-assisted treatment is basically just asking the simple question, is there a medication that has been proven scientifically to improve our success rate in that particular goal? You know, so there are medication-assisted treatment or MAT options available for certain substance use disorders, not all of them, you know. And what these are that, you know, they're medications that are FDA approved that have been shown through research studies and not, you know, superficial, hokey research studies. Like these are large, double-blind, placebo-controlled studies done with strict scientific rigor, you know, that shows that medication, and I'm not talking about something that makes the person feel a little better or helps manage symptoms. That actually improves their success rate in establishing stable long-term recovery. So, you know, for alcohol use disorder, there's three of them. There's disulfiram or antabuse. There is Camprol or acamprosate. Okay, and then there's naltrexone or Revivivitrol are the trade names for that. For opioid use disorder, there's methadone, there's the buprenorphine products, and there's naltrexone. And one of the big things that we see when we talk about medication-assisted treatment is the stigma against medication-assisted treatment, you know, from other people. And I understand that perfectly well. You know, when my brother first entered treatment and got on methadone as part of his MAT, I was the one who took him to the methadone clinic. And I'm looking around at all these other people that are on methadone. And like many family members, you know, that little internal voice in my head is just looking around and filled with hell knows, you know, everywhere that I'm looking. Like this isn't what I imagined, you know, treatment and recovery would look like.
Yeah.
That was the one thing that actually worked for him, you know, that resulted in him stabilizing in recovery. And I, at the time, had some of those same sort of misunderstandings and stigma. And so when I hear that from other family members and communities saying like, no, methadone, that's just trading one addiction for another. Suboxone, that's just trading one addiction for another. I'm very quick to kind of educate them like, not necessarily, okay? There's a difference between addiction and chemical dependence, which is something that we can get into. Addiction, by definition, is destructive, okay? And the idea with MAT is that you're trading that destructive addiction for a more stable chemical dependence that you can control and that you can wean up or down over time and that you can regulate and monitor. And for people that are at those end stages of addiction, I mean, that's not only is that incredibly helpful, but it's necessary. And some of the statistics, like I'll share with people, like, so if somebody goes to 30 days of abstinence-based rehab, they go off to Passages Malibu for a month and they come home, they have a 97% failure rate. Okay. 97% of those people are going to fail and relapse. When you add in methadone in a similar situation, that person, their success rate is going to go from 3 to 5% up to around 30 to 35%. It's not ideal. It's not 95% success rate.
Yeah.
But there's another really important thing to add in there. The person that's on methadone is now 98% less likely to die of an opioid overdose. And it's because several reasons. One is because, their body has that opioid, that long-acting opioid in their system at all times. Okay, so it's becoming more and more used to opioids being on the receptors. Number two, sometimes it's even not as much as we would want with treatment, but it's more a form of harm reduction. Like, we're now laying eyes on that person every day. That was a really important thing for my brother. He was squatting in a house, homeless, a dead dog in the corner of the house. I mean, it was absolute rock bottom, and just having him show up at a clinic every day where someone was laying eyes on him and verifying that he's alive and giving him that medication. Like, statistically, we know that there's that 98% less likely to die. And shouldn't that trump all of our little uncomfortable feelings about it? Like, that should be the only statistic that we have to say. They're 98% less likely to die. And now, if all that does is buy time until they're ready to take it more seriously, then that's a worthwhile endeavor,
Yes.
And we need to get away from that whole stigma where, people are quick to jump to, oh, let them all overdose and die. Let them all kill themselves. Let them get one dose of Narcan and that's it. Like, that's all BS. It's all political grandstanding. It's all just, shouting from the mountaintops without actually taking the time to educate yourself and understand, what's happening in the brain, of that individual. And so, when we talk about MAT, some of them you do develop a chemical dependence to, not all of them. But even in those situations, the idea is that we're leaving the destructive addiction in the rearview mirror and we're trading it for this more stable chemical dependence, that we can work on over time.
And you had said, and I've heard this as like overlying theme of like human connection, right? I know Alyssa's brought that up too. So that's almost like that's an opportunity for them to have some type of human like connection, right?
Yeah.
Even if it is just walking in and getting their medicine and taking it and leaving, there's still some sort of human connection there. So rather than just being stuck in a house. So when we're talking about trends in substance abuse, right? Many of the current trends are known, right? We talked about that. You talked about that a lot today at the symposium, but the details around fentanyl. So if you want to get into fentanyl and then how like it's sort of shifting now, right?
Yeah, certainly. So fentanyl has completely changed the game of opioid use disorder and the opioids that are circulating on the streets. And the reason why is because you no longer need to cultivate it, harvest it, refine it, process it, and ship it from a plant, right? So we talked about that a little bit earlier at the symposium, but most of the opioids, that we've dealt with traditionally, from morphine to heroin to oxycodone, like that's all coming from the Papaver somniferum plant, which is that kind of pretty tropical plant with purple flowers and that little green bulb that's in the center. When you crack that bulb open, there's a milky white substance in there that was called milk of the poppy, in ancient times. Okay. And for generations and for, really centuries, it's been known that if you refine that milky substance and create opioids from that, that those opioids were used as a painkiller, as a sedative. This goes all the way back into ancient Egyptian scripture. There's actually documentation of people using the poppy plant or the milk of the poppy.
I feel like I've heard that, like milk of the poppy before,
and
in little vials
like
or
that.
yeah.
Right.
Okay.
And I mean, it's been, substance abuse has been a part of the human experience for as long as humans have been writing things down, truthfully. And what changed with fentanyl is that fentanyl is a synthetic opioid. That means that you can make it in a lab, right? So you no longer have to find a warm tropical climate to grow this plant and farmers to, successfully, cultivate it and harvest it. And then the processing, the refining, the sneaking it across borders, like all that stuff goes away with fentanyl. And fentanyl is incredibly potent. It's 100 times more powerful than morphine. So why wouldn't the market kind of take it in that direction, and that's exactly what's happened. And in a very scary way, it's kind of changed everything, because back when, when we were kids, right? Like we would hear those stories about, be careful with your drugs, they might be laced, right?
Yeah.
And when did we ever find somebody whose drugs were laced? Like it didn't happen, right? Like we were told that your marijuana might have PCP in it, or, this drug might have LSD and you're going to have a bad trip and all this kind of stuff. But like, I never met anybody that, was engaging in that kind of stuff and then all of a sudden, was exposed to some drug that was laced into the, with fentanyl. That is no longer a scare story. Like fentanyl, because it's so cheap and because it's easy to make and because it's tiny little amounts are so incredibly potent, not only has it replaced all the heroin, like we don't see heroin anymore. We
you said
only
that.
see fentanyl. And it's been about a year since I've seen that 6-MP-acetylmorphine, which is the metabolite that we see with heroin. Now it's all just the metabolites of fentanyl. And at first you saw that happening slowly, and now it's just sort of across the board, it's taken over. Even the pills that people think they're buying, they think they're buying oxycodone or Roxicet or whatever it is. It's just fentanyl that's pressed into a pill. And these pill presses, you can buy them online, and the dark web, you can buy your fentanyl powders. And so, I just literally a week ago, I watched a whole story on American Greed about how some young 25-year-old entrepreneur got himself a pill press, and was literally making like $1 million a week, for years, pressing these and selling them on the dark web. I'll send you the episode on American Greed if you want to watch it. But it's, that those are the kind of things that have been happening for a decade, in all of these communities. This was just one kid, who was doing it. I believe it was in Utah or something like that. But when we see those pills now, one of my friends that's a DEA agent tells me, he's like, we barely ever find actual pharmaceutical grade Roxicet and oxycodone. It's all fentanyl. And he said the first thing he does is he takes that pill and he sees if it'll write and leave like a trail on a piece of paper. And if it does, chances are it's illicit and it's fentanyl, because the pharmaceutical grade ones are encapsulated in a way that they won't write like that.
Okay.
But that's also, led to the emergence of things like fentanyl testing strips and things like that. That's not meant for the quote unquote heroin addict or fentanyl addict. Like they know they're getting fentanyl. They already know that. Those fentanyl test strips are meant for like the college kids who are experimenting, who think they bought cocaine, only to later overdose and find out that there was fentanyl in it. Well, if that's the situation and they use those fentanyl test strips, they can keep themselves safe. They can experiment in a more responsible manner, if you want to call experimentation, responsible.
Of course.
That fentanyl being present at all levels. And what's crazy is like they didn't just stop at fentanyl, right? Like then all of a sudden carfentanil came along, and that's like an elephant tranquilizer. One tiny little grain of that will cause an overdose. And now we're seeing other synthetic opioids that are going to follow in the footsteps of fentanyl. There's this isonitazine or nitazene, or ISO as it's called. That's starting to make its way across the border. The DEA just put out a big article on that about a month ago. And so even if we did away with fentanyl, until we're dealing with the underlying processes and causes that are making people self-medicate and causing that initial experimentation to turn into daily use. And until we're addressing the root cause, we're just putting little Band-Aids on things, and ultimately that's where the worlds of addiction medicine and mental health, intersect and collide, as they should, because it's very rare that you're dealing with one without the other. When we're talking about addiction, there is often a coexisting mental health component in there somewhere, and not always, but oftentimes, and that's where you really have to dig into the entire history. That the choices over time that led to this, their family history, their coexisting medical history, their coexisting psychiatric history, and you really have to put all the pieces of the puzzle together, to figure out what you need to do moving forward. But fentanyl has been something that has changed things dramatically in a way that, like, when the mental health of this country was already poor, and then you add in the internet, and then you add in social media, and then you add in fentanyl, and I mean, it's just been a dumpster fire, for the past 20 years.
Well, now with vapes, because you brought this up today, is the idea behind them putting fentanyl into these marijuana vapes to make it even more addictive than it normally? I mean, like, what's the purpose behind doing that, I guess?
That's a great question. And
do you know what I mean? Like, I'm like, they're already buying a substance that's helping them, so why are we adding? And
there have been some great, conversations about that. Like, Vice did a documentary where they actually talked to drug dealers, about that, and we're getting information from the sources. And certainly I tell people, that my belief, of course, is that, as nefarious and scrupulous and negative as, those drug dealers, we can talk about that all day. But the bottom line is they're doing it to make money. Okay. And if they kill their customer, they're not going to make money. Right. So their goal is not to kill their customer. Their goal is to set themselves apart from the other drug dealers and providers, that theirs is a little more special in some way. So whether it be that little bit of added euphoria that it adds into the effects of the drug, or it actually be that it keeps them coming back for more and more because of the chemical dependence.
Because of that, yes. Yeah. Okay.
You get different answers to that question depending on, of course, who you talk to and what their motivation was to include that fentanyl. But the fact of the matter is it's now become so cheap and so readily available that they look at it as like, it's like sprinkling a little salt on my dish, that I'm serving to my customer. If that's going to make it more appealing in any way, it's now become like something inexpensive that they can do, that they can add to it. And it's terrifying, right? Because, like, I mean, you take a little bag of cocaine and you sprinkle in a little bit of fentanyl, like the naked eye cannot tell the difference between, what's in those two bags, right?
Yeah.
And it just recently here, we've had stories of, those 5 kids in the apartment in Southside Pittsburgh. They thought they were going to a rave. They thought they were doing cocaine. They all overdosed on fentanyl. I know a person who her husband literally, like, his thing was, ever since college, every Sunday he would do a line or two of coke and watch all of his football games. And she didn't like it, but she would tolerate it. One day she comes home, he's dead on the coffee table. There was fentanyl in the cocaine. They had no idea. It making its way into the bootleg marijuana vapes is a whole different animal of scary, right? Because, like, we know that middle schoolers and high schools are experimenting heavily with marijuana products, and they certainly don't have any idea or suspicion that there could be some fentanyl, in that product. But that could literally be an experimentation that results in their death just because of that, especially if they're opioid naive and there's a little bit more, opioids in their substance that they're abusing, than in the one they used the last time, or the one that they're used to. And these things aren't, when we're talking about bootleg drugs and illicit drugs, like, nobody's monitoring the safety and efficacy and how much concentration of this versus that. It's usually, some young knucklehead, who's think he's being an entrepreneur, putting this stuff together in his basement, so that he can make a buck, and it's sad, but we're all dealing with the consequences of those scenarios, and it's affecting every community. You find these communities that don't think they're being impacted, and then through a little education, they realize how much they're actually, being affected by these kind of things.
Well, I mean, obviously for a college kid who's going to buy a pill machine or a pill press and make $1 million a week, he doesn't care really what it's going to do to whoever he's selling it to. I mean,
what's interesting is when you watch that, like that it wasn't just this one kid, it was him and like his 5 closest friends. And they all convinced themselves of this delusion that people are being cut off from their pain medications, and a lot of these people actually just need pain medications and aren't able to get them. And of course, that's their own self-justification of, you know, why is it okay, you know, to go further down this rabbit hole. But just the fact that they're doing it on the dark web and being extremely secretive and taking Bitcoin as payment, like they clearly know that the moral and ethical, you know, conundrum that they're dealing with there. But as we know, you know, people will convince themselves of anything if it's improving their quality of life or helping them reach their goals. And you know, you can argue the same thing for some big pharmaceutical companies that, you know, can flirt with danger a little bit in the pursuit of the almighty dollar, right? Certainly not the same. We can't equate that to a kid selling, you know, fentanyl pressed pills out of his basement. Yeah. But it's part of the human psychological profile and spectrum, you know. So it's something that you know, should be at least a part of that conversation.
Well, and that's a whole nother addiction, which we're not talking
money,
about.
right.
But that's, and you were, as you're talking, I'm like, gosh, there's a lot of greedy people out there who are doing this just for that.
Yeah.
Okay, so Joe, we're going to kind of shift gears here just a little bit. You know, when we want to talk about addiction, obviously underlying, which I know you've both spoken about, mental health, right? The importance of integrated treatment when it comes to mental health.
Yeah, I mean, the field of addiction treatment is constantly changing and growing and expanding. And really what we're seeing now, and we have our clinical director at the Ellen O'Brien Geyser Center is just celebrating her 20th year in the field in addiction treatment. And, you know, she said 20 years ago when she started, their kind of average client, I guess, would be an older gentleman who has been a lifelong alcoholic. It was very rare to find somebody younger that was coming into treatment, maybe under 50, that was seeking out treatment. And it was very rare to find anybody coming into treatment that would have had mental health diagnoses. And if they did have mental health diagnoses, it was maybe a pretty mild depression or anxiety. You know, kind of, you know, we hate to say it with mental health, but quote unquote run of the mill. Right. So something that is pretty common in society, that we do talk about depression, anxiety a little bit now, more than we did. You know, there's media ads and articles about it. You know, we always think of those little Zoloft cloud or whatever on our commercials for the antidepressants. So, you know, that is a little more, that's why I say run of the mill, because that's a little more ingrained, I think, in our society and our kind of collective conscience. What we are seeing now, though, as she's reflected back on 20 years, is it is very, very rare now to find somebody coming to us for addiction treatment that does not have a mental health diagnosis with them. It is now the exception that they don't have a mental health diagnosis, more so than it was 20 years ago, where it was kind of like, wow, it would blow their minds if they had somebody that had a mental health diagnosis. So, you know, it's really, we can't separate it out anymore. And not to get on a soapbox, but, you know, PA always sort of had this very unusual view of addiction treatment and mental health treatment, that they had it in 2 separate silos. And other states had it more integrated into just an overall behavioral health model. And PA always, and you know, you could do a whole podcast on that. But PA always had
on Pennsylvania, or just like,
well, you know, Pennsylvania and their historical approach to addiction treatment and mental health treatment. Okay. But it was driven by the insurance companies, and it was always, you know, mental health's over here, addiction treatment's over here. You're kind of supposed to work together, but not really. So if you know, you're coming into me as a clinician and your presenting problem is, say, anxiety, and we're going through your assessment, and through your assessment, some red flags start going off, because guess what? Every mental health screening has to ask for addiction. So as you're screening and you get to the addiction questions, you're like, this person's drinking a case of Miller Lite every night. Might need to look at some addiction treatment for this. Mm-hmm. The insurance companies would have said, that's great. Refer them to an addiction treatment center to deal with their addiction issues. They can then come back to you, but you can only talk to them about their anxiety issues. So they walk across the street, go to the addiction treatment, do their screen over there. Addiction treatment always has to screen for mental health. Addiction treatment starts getting some red flags on mental health, and they will say, no, you're too mental health for us. You got to go back over there to the mental health center. Mental health saying you're too addiction for us because we're not specialized in that. PA never trained, like there was never a cross training of clinicians. It was either your mental health or addiction treatment. That was it.
Okay.
You had to have some working knowledge of both, but to truly feel confident and comfortable in dealing with that kind of other end of the spectrum there, not many clinicians still to this day feel that because it's so complex. So they really, PA really historically had convoluted the treatment, and to the point where the person seeking treatment would get so frustrated because they are seeking help. They're trying to get help, and nobody will help them because you're too much one way, too much the other way. And really, when you boil it back, it was all insurance, driven by insurance, because insurance will say, I'm not paying you for that service because you're not addiction treatment. So we have come leaps and bounds since then into integrating treatment, because we know, and luckily people that in power, in the state level, and the national level, and the insurance level, people are complex. We all have at any given moment a variety of issues, right, that we could present with. It's not so easy to tease out just one issue that, you're struggling right now with alcohol use. Let's just focus on that. Right. But let's not talk about the anxiety or the trauma that you have that may be leading you to that. Let's not talk about your physical health, because we don't do that either here, even though, as we know, people that use alcohol, for instance, have a ton of physical health issues as a result of their alcohol use.
Yes.
But they never were to address that either. It had to be kind of addiction in a silo and in isolation. So we are getting better at integrating treatment now because we are recognizing the complexities of this. And when we look at this integrated treatment, there's a lot of talk on, was it a mental health issue that sort of led somebody to start using, or did somebody start using and then exacerbated mental health, a mental health issue? And sort of our approach is, why does it matter? Why does it matter what led to what in that moment? Yeah. What matters is that we have to kind of treat and intervene with what's presenting in front of us at this moment. And we always first go to safety as we look at priorities. So we have to do whatever we need to do to get you safe, and then we can start peeling back the layers there. But it doesn't matter. Our approach is that it doesn't matter when you're presenting to us for addiction treatment on, are you doing that because you're depressed? Or are you depressed because you're doing that? It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant to us. It's, you're doing that harmful behavior that is causing all these disturbances in your life. So let's help you get to a place where, we can get you into recovery. We can rewire the brain, the neural pathway, neuroplasticity can start to take effect. And then once you're in that safe place, and that can years sometimes, then we start to peel back of what led you to that point to begin with. And I know you're going to have our clinical supervisor on here in a couple days, Melissa Vorel. She's our trauma expert. But really, she'll delve into this much better than I would. But a lot of it is trauma related when we peel back the layers. Yes. And when we look at trauma, I think everybody has this idea of trauma, and when I say everybody, I just mean society at large, of the post-traumatic stress, the soldier coming back from war, who's having nightmares and flashbacks, and all those kind of physiological symptoms that you can see on the surface. And yes, that is trauma, and that is post-traumatic stress disorder. Those are key components of post-traumatic stress disorder. But you might be thinking to yourself, how many recovering war vets do you have, at your center that have this trauma? Trauma is so much bigger than that. It is whatever an event happens that sort of overwhelms your capacity to cope with that event. And it's not even so much the event itself, it's your perception of that event. So the key component of trauma historically was, it's sort of where you feel like your life is being threatened or the life of somebody you care about is being threatened. And yeah, that's still part of it, but there are other events throughout somebody's life that may be looked at as a trauma when we start pulling it back. And, when we talk about trauma, we also look at, well, if we're both in a car accident, the same car accident, I have PTSD and he doesn't. How does that happen? Why does that happen? And again, that then becomes this complex thing of experience, life experiences, and your own ability to cope.
Yes.
And what you can comfortably cope with. But it also comes to, how do we build resilience? And how do we give you the skills that you need to do to sort of do whatever you need to do to work through that experience and then skill build of that, so that experience doesn't then impact your life negatively consistently. So that's really what we look at when we look at trauma overall, and when they come into us for addiction treatment, is we sort of look at what those events were in their lives, and then we try to skill build with them, because it's all about the skill. How do we do that?
Okay.
And the science, to sort of just add on to that, when we look at the DSM, which is sort of like the Bible of psychiatry, right? In the first 10 pages of the DSM, it tells you cannot diagnose any of the mental health conditions in this book until somebody has been off substances for 6 months.
Yes.
And that doesn't ever happen because it's so difficult to get somebody abstinent off all substances for 6 months. But the reason why that statement, that disclaimer is in the DSM is because substance use and substance withdrawal both mimic mental health conditions so much, because ultimately we're talking about the same things here. We're talking about abnormal neurochemistry and abnormal neurophysiology, which is basically like the firing patterns, these neural circuits that exist, in all of our brains that help us, either cope with our day-to-day stresses, anxieties, whatever, and those neural pathways that they can change over time. But exactly like Joe said, like it doesn't matter which of those things came first. Like, we're dealing with abnormal neurochemistry and abnormal neurophysiology.
Thank you for tuning in to Alter Eagle. Join me every Monday for a new episode, and be sure to click subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. Follow us on Instagram at Alter Eagle Podcast. Until next time, stay safe, stay hopeful, stay kind.